In my view, there is certainly historically reliable information in the Gospels, of course. But there are also pieces of historically unreliable information. This can be seen by the fact that sometimes there are flat-out discrepancies between the Gospels, as you will see yourself if you just read them carefully side by side. Let me give you just a taste out of 1,000 examples. The Gospel of Matthew says that the father of Joseph, Jesus' father, was Jacob. His grandfather was Mathan, and his great-grandfather was Eleazar. The Gospel of Luke says that Joseph's father was Heli. His grandfather was Mathat, and his great-grandfather was Levi. Well, which was it? The genealogies differ. One of the key motives of the Gospel of Mark is that Jesus' disciples don't recognize him as the Messiah until chapter 8. But in the Gospel of John, they call him the Messiah right away, the first time they meet him in chapter 1. Which is it? How could it be both? There are small discrepancies between the Gospels, hundreds of them. Was Jairus' daughter sick but still alive when Jairus came to ask Jesus to heal her, as in Mark? Or did she just die before Jairus came, so that he asked Jesus to raise her from the dead, as in Matthew? Hard to see how it could be both ways. The Gospel of John says explicitly that Jesus died on the day of preparation for Passover, the afternoon before the Passover meal was eaten. The Gospel of Mark says explicitly that Jesus died the morning after the Passover meal was eaten. Don't take my word for it. Read John 19 and Mark 15 for yourself. They contradict each other. Or look at the resurrection accounts in the four Gospels sometime and ask yourself, how many women went to the empty tomb? What were their names? Was the stone rolled away before the women arrived or after they got there? What did they see there? One man, two men, or two angels? What were they told to do? To tell the disciples to go to Galilee or not? Did they tell the disciples or not? Did the disciples go to Galilee or not? It depends which gospel you read. You get a different story every time. We should not say that these are a bunch of details and don't affect the larger picture. The larger picture is made up of nothing but details. The big pictures are vastly different too, as you'll see once you allow yourself to admit that the details are all different up and down the line. In my opinion now, the accounts of the Gospels cannot be reliable because they differ in hundreds of ways, both big and small, and they contain numerous historical. My question is the Bible then inaccurate in some of the things that it says Jesus said? If so, if it's inaccurate in some things, how do we know that it's not inaccurate in lots of things? And if it's inaccurate in lots of things, what makes us think we can trust it? As a historian, I'm absolutely certain that the Gospels contain sayings that Jesus did not say. One way to prove that is to point to the discrepancies of his sayings from one gospel to the next, which I could easily do and you can do for yourself. We could, in fact, spend 2 or 3 hours here while I simply list the discrepancies. But I'd like to take a different approach by dealing with just one kind of saying of Jesus in my couple minutes that remain. There is no doubt that in the Gospel of John, the fourth Gospel, Jesus understands himself to be God and explicitly calls himself divine. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. But he also says, I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am. These are sayings found only in the Gospel of John. Jesus calls himself God in the Gospel of John, the latest of our Gospels, but what is striking is that he never calls himself God in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, our earliest Gospels. I don't think Jesus really said these things. And so far as I know, either does any other critical biblical scholar. I know of hundreds of biblical scholars, but I don't personally know any scholar of the Gospel of John, except for extremely conservative evangelicals or fundamentalists, who think that John accurately records all of the words of Jesus. If Craig thinks he does, if he thinks that Jesus did go around Galilee and Jerusalem calling himself God, I'd like him to explain to me on historical, not theological grounds, but historical grounds, how Jesus managed to escape getting stoned to death for blasphemy. And more important, how it is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't record him calling himself God. That seems like a rather important point. Did they just forget to mention that part? And why is it that whenever you read the Gospel of John, it doesn't matter what part of John you read, whether you read the words of John the Baptist, the words of Jesus, or the words of the narrator who's writing the Gospel, all three sound exactly alike. How could three such different men sound just the same and speak the same theology? It doesn't matter what parts of John you read, it all sounds the same. Why? Because in the Gospel of John, we're not hearing three voices, John the Baptist, Jesus, and the narrator. We're hearing one voice, the voice of the author. The author has modified the voices of John the Baptist and Jesus to make them say what he wants them to say. This is not Jesus' voice we're hearing. It's the voice of the Gospel of John, the author. Why does this matter? Because people in our world continue to ask, is Jesus who he said he was? If you read the Gospel of John, you don't learn who Jesus said he was. You learn who John said. Compare it in detail with the same story in another Gospel. You will see multiple differences. During Jesus' temptations, what was the second temptation? To jump off the temple or to bow down to worship Satan? Matthew says the first, Luke says the second. If one of the authors felt free to change the details of the story, how do you know that he didn't feel free to change the substance of the story? Did Jesus ride one animal into Jerusalem at the triumphal entry, as in Mark, or did he ride two animals, as in Matthew? Did Jesus have extensive conversations at his trial with Pilate, as in John? Or was he silent, except for uttering two words, as in Mark? How could it be both? But sometimes the stories are not simply different in minor detail. They are sometimes different in major ways. Let me give you just one example in the couple minutes I have left. Jesus, on the way to his death, in the Gospel of Mark, is completely silent. He carries his cross, or Simon of Cyrene carries his cross, and Jesus doesn't say a word. They nail him to the cross, and he's silent. He's hanging on the cross. Both robbers mock him. The passers-by mock him. Everybody mocks him, and he doesn't say anything until the very end. He cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And he dies. That's the end of the story in Mark. Not quite, because then he gets raised from the dead. But how did he feel at the end? Compare that with the Gospel of Luke. In Luke, Jesus is not silent on the way to be crucified. He's going to be crucified, and he sees some women weeping for him by the side of the road, and he turns to them and says, Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children for the fate that's to befall you. Jesus, in Luke's Gospel, is more concerned about these women than he is about his own fate. When being nailed to the cross, in Luke's Gospel, he's not silent. He says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. In Luke's Gospel, he's hanging on the cross and he has an intelligent conversation with one of the robbers. Only one of the robbers mocks him in Luke. The other tells the first robber to be quiet because Jesus has done nothing to deserve this. He turns his head to Jesus and says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replies to him, Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus does not feel forsaken the way he does in Mark. In Luke's Gospel, he knows he's on God's side. God is behind the proceeding. He knows what's going to happen to him. He knows why it's going to happen to him. He knows what's going to happen to him after it happens to him. He's going to wake up in paradise, and this guy's going to be with him in Luke's Gospel. And at the end, rather than crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He doesn't say that in Luke. In Luke's Gospel, he says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And he dies. This is a very different portrayal of Jesus going to his death from Mark. What everybody does, of course, is they take Mark's account and they take Luke's account and they smash them together into one big account. So Jesus says everything that he says in Mark, everything he says in Luke, then you throw in what he says in Matthew and what he says in John, and you end up with the 7 last words of the dying Jesus, which you find in none of the Gospels. You are free to do that, to smash them all together. So that Mark's portrayal isn't right, Luke's isn't right, what's right is the one that you've combined. But realize what you've done is you've written your own gospel, rather than trusting any of the Gospels of the New Testament. The problem is the Gospels of the New Testament do not agree either on the sayings of Jesus